strong cross-border spillover effects through trade, tourism, and financial linkages. This year, survey highlights COVID-19 pandemic as an immediate risk to the region's economic outlook, deepening the economic slowdown. Despite significant uncertainties surrounding the pandemic, the negative impacts are likely to be substantial. The ESCAP report suggests that in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic, policymakers should maintain accommodative macroeconomic policies to sustain the economic health of the region. At the same time, countries should take the opportunity posed by these challenging times to rethink their economic development strategies towards a more inclusive, sustainable, and planet-friendly economy. Almost for the last decade, our subregional office every year arrange informal discussion on survey publication with participation of different stakeholders. This year is not an exclusion. And to make the discussion more interesting, we invited eminent experts to share their views. I would like to suggest to start our meeting with the ESCAP presentation on economic and social survey. And for this purpose, I would like to give the floor to Zhenjian Huang, Associate Economic Affairs Officer, Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division of ESCAP. She was an active member of the core group that produced this survey. And before, she was an economist for the United Kingdom's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. She holds MA in Public Administration, as well as in Social Policy and Planning, and BA in Economics and Philosophy. So, Zhenjian, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you for the kind introduction. Let me quickly put the slides onto the screen. Okay. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for participating. I'm very happy to present you our Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2020. The title of this year's survey is Towards Sustainable Economies. We have 4 key messages from this year's survey. First, Asia and the Pacific, including North and Central Asia, is not on track to achieve the SDGs, in particular sustainable consumption and production and the environmental well-being. The economic growth-centric development approach should be revisited. Second, the current economic slowdown exacerbated by COVID-19 should not deter our journey towards the 2030 agenda. In the wake of the pandemic and the climate emergency, North and Central Asian countries should embed long-term sustainability in policy responses. This requires collective policy actions led by governments and supported by businesses and people, along with enhanced global and regional cooperation. The region's economic growth-centric development approach has come with costs to people and the planet. Over the past 2 decades, the Asia-Pacific region has maintained high growth rates, which has contributed to income growth and job creation. This has lifted over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. Now, let me flip the line of poverty reduction. So now if you see the poverty line is trending up, it means reduction in poverty. So in the past 2 decades, as we can see from the figure, the reduction in extreme poverty has taken place at almost the same rate as income growth. However, those lifted out of extreme poverty are still vulnerable If we raise our ambition on poverty reduction from $1.9 per day to $3.2 per day or $5.5 per day, the number of people put above the higher poverty lines appear marginal, and the reduction is almost stagnant in recent years. Additionally, the Asia-Pacific region faces a high level of inequality. As the figure shows, the top 10% of income group take away half of the income, while the bottom 50% of income group only take about 10% of income. And the more worrisome thing is the growth-centric development approach's cost to our planet. The Asia-Pacific region's GDP growth is largely dependent on resource use. Surging resource use has contributed to massive increase in CO2 emissions, which has heightened the region's climate risks. There are some similar trends in North and Central Asia subregion. Economic growth has contributed to income growth, job creation, and has contributed to poverty reductions. However, poverty reduction has been stagnant in North and Central Asia in the last decade. Inequality situation in North and Central Asia presents a mixed picture. Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality, in Russia and Georgia has fluctuated but remained high. Gini coefficient in Tajikistan and Armenia has been increasing in recent years. And in comparison, Gini coefficient in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan has been on a downward trend. Resource use has largely contributed to North and Central Asia countries' economic growth, which has fed into CO2 emissions. At the same time, air pollution levels are above the WHO guideline across North and Central Asia subregion. Therefore, it is not surprising this kind of unbalanced development approach is holding back the Asia-Pacific region from achieving sustainable development. Here are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This figure illustrates the region's progress of achieving the 17 goals. Here, the blue and the red bars illustrated progress of SDGs as of 2019. If a bar is in red, then it means a regression, and if the bar is in blue, it means a progress. And the vertical black line in the middle illustrates the anticipated progress in 2019 if the region was on track to achieve the SDGs. It is very clear that none of the goals are on the track. In particular, Goal 12, responsible consumption and production, has regressed the most, along with Goal 13 on climate change. You may not be fully aware of what the Goal 12 includes. I'd like to provide a bit more background. Here, SDG Goal 12 is ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. It includes 8 main targets and several sub-targets, which focus on sustainable resource management, sustainable business practices and reporting, sustainable tourism, sustainable public procurement practices, sustainable market mechanisms, sustainable living, sustainable finance, and etc. In North and Central Asia, the progress on Goal 12 provides a mixed picture. For instance, the progress on sustainable resource management is stagnant. This has contributed to greenhouse gas emissions. Given Goal 12 is closely linked with other goals, transforming our consumption and production patterns and making them more sustainable can be an effective way to accelerate the progress towards the 2030 agenda. To do so, it requires revisiting our current consumption and production patterns. This would require behavioral change by different stakeholders because the current production and consumption patterns and the consequent impact on climate are determined by them. Our report focuses on 3 major stakeholders: governments, business, and the consumers. Different stakeholders have their own interests, which keeps the status quo alive. For instance, governments depend on revenue from fossil fuels, which has fed into underpricing of carbon. Business focus on maximizing profits for their shareholders, ignoring externalities of their businesses' activities on other stakeholders. And consumers may have their own consumption habits, and they're also not aware of the environmental impact of their consumption behavior. However, the path to transform our consumption production pattern is not smooth. The near-term economic challenges may require sole focus on reviving short-term GDP growth, but we should not lose sight of our long-term vision for sustainable development. As we all know, COVID-19 has significantly affected the economic performance globally and regionally. Countries have introduced measures to contain COVID-19, such as travel restrictions, suspension of production, and lockdown of cities. These measures have affected people and companies, which introduces shocks from both the supply and demand sides. These kind of shocks have spillover effects. For instance, manufacturers are affected through supply chains, and the lower demand for commodities has affected commodity exporters. Until now, the COVID-19 pandemic is still not fully contained. Our latest estimates show that the economic growth for developing Asia and the Pacific region is expected to slow by over 4 percentage points in 2020. For North and Central Asia, economic growth is expected to lower by 6 percentage points. Of course, the economic losses would be borne unevenly across countries, depending on their economic conditions and their exposure to COVID-19. One key factor that affects North and Central Asian countries is surely the oil price. COVID-19 has severely affected demand for oil, which put a downward pressure on oil prices. Meanwhile, price competition between the major oil producers pushed the oil prices down. As we can see from the left-hand side figure, the Brent crude oil price was below $10 per barrel in late April. Many economies in North and Central Asia still heavily rely on fuel exports. The figure on the right shows fuel exports as a share of GDP, and the North and Central Asian countries are marked in red bars. As we can see in Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Russia, and Uzbekistan, their fuel exports account for more than 20% of their GDP. Significantly lower than expected oil prices could mean budget shortfalls, pressure on currencies, and even economic recession. In addition to fuel prices, lower remittance inflows and tourism revenues affect North and Central Asian countries' economic performance as well. The left figure shows personal remittance inflows as a share of GDP. Again, the North and Central Asian countries are marked in red. In Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, for example, remittance inflows account for over 30% of their GDP. Border closures and a decreased demand for labor in Central Asia's migrants in traditional destination countries such as Russia, it has imposed challenges for countries that rely on remittances because a large number of migrants, they are forced to stay home. Without steady inflows of remittances, many households could be forced back into poverty. Suspension of economic activities has heavily hit the service sector as well. The right figure shows tourism's income, its share in GDP. In Georgia, for example, tourism income accounts for about 20% of GDP. In the first few weeks of 2020, the mood for Georgia's tourism sector was still very positive, but then the COVID-19 came and its tourism industry was hit severely. Now, there are some North and Central Asian countries have released their GDP growth in the first quarter of 2020. For example, Russia's GDP slowed to 1.6% in the first quarter, Azerbaijan 0.2%, Georgia 1.5%. Most of their economic activity slowed, but the growth rates remained positive. This is because the oil price crash took place in early March, and the countries did not implement the lockdown measures until late March. So we are expecting the situation in the second quarter could be much worse. In the face of the pandemic, what policy responses that North and Central Asian countries have introduced, and what else can be done? Our key message here is that policy responses to COVID-19 should prioritize people over economic recovery. North and Central Asian countries have implemented containment measures to slow the spread of COVID-19, such as travel bans, social distancing, closure of public places, and etc. In addition to these containment measures, large and targeted fiscal spending is also needed to contain and respond to COVID-19 and ease the shocks to jobs and guarantee minimum living standards for people. In this regard, most of the Asia-Pacific countries have announced fiscal support packages. The figure illustrates the size of the fiscal packages as a share of GDP. The gray bars illustrate the range of the size for each country group, and the orange dash in the middle represents the median of the size of fiscal packages for each country group. So we can see the fiscal package differ across countries, and in Asia-Pacific region as a whole, the median size of fiscal package is about 2.8% of GDP. And in North and Central Asia, it's about 2% of GDP. But of course, the situation is still quickly evolving because countries are still introducing new supportive packages. These fiscal packages that have been announced, they are targeting to support healthcare systems and help the businesses and households in need. In addition to this spending to cope with the short-term challenges imposed by COVID-19, it is also important for countries to enhance resilience to deal with such crises in the future. Therefore, it is essential to build ex-ante emergency preparedness to save lives and minimize economic impacts. Our estimates show that for the Asia-Pacific region, it needs to invest an additional $880 million per year through 2030 in emergency preparedness. Countries should also increase investment in social protection because social protection can perform as an automatic stabilizer when crisis hit. This figure shows that public spending on social protection in Asia-Pacific countries are relatively low compared with the global average, which is the green line on the top. This is also true in North and Central Asia countries. Last year, our team estimated that to provide a social protection floor in North and Central Asia would require an additional annual investment of 1.7% of GDP. This should be within reach. Now, many countries, they're planning to reopen their countries and they're designing economic recovery packages. It is very important that these recovery policies should be linked to investment needs and priorities for achieving the SDGs. Many countries in North and Central Asia, they are landlocked countries, but they're with great geo-economic potentials. So recovery policies should focus on improving their connectivity, physically and virtually. Investment in transport and ICT sector could serve for this purpose, and these investments should take climate resilience into consideration. Let's look at the figure on the left. Last year, we estimated that North and Central Asian countries should invest an additional annual amount of 0.9% of GDP in ICT and the transport infrastructure altogether, with climate resilience included. Meanwhile, North and Central Asian countries should continue to diversify their economies, reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, and increase the use of renewable energy. As shown in the figure on the right, the subregion should invest about 1.1% of GDP to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix and to improve energy efficiency. These investments are expected to impact on countries' fiscal balance. However, North and Central Asia's fiscal position is relatively stronger than the rest of the Asia-Pacific region, thanks to countries' efforts to improve fiscal balance, including installing fiscal rules after the last round of oil price crash. In fact, North and Central Asia subregion is the only subregion that has a fiscal surplus, which is marked in red in this figure. Similarly, the public debt to GDP level in North and Central Asia is relatively low compared with other subregions in Asia and the Pacific. But according to IMF's forecast, in 2020, all the North and Central Asia countries are expected to experience fiscal deficits. And some countries, they have announced to increase their public debt. So some countries, they are expected to see increasing in their debt levels. To support the fiscal position and to finance the spending, countries should consider phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. The current low oil and gas prices offer an opportunity. For Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan, the size of their fossil fuel subsidy is big enough to cover the fiscal support packages announced so far. For Russia, the size of fossil fuel subsidies account for a major share of its fiscal package. Additionally, monetary policy can help sustain business operations in a targeted way and support the health and the sustainability of financial sector. So far, 6 countries in North and Central Asia have lowered their interest rates. Of course, there are some other measures announced, including providing targeted financial support through subsidized loans for SMEs, for example. In addition to fiscal and monetary policies, it's equally important to enhance regional cooperation to combat COVID-19. Here, the region can consider coordinate debt relief or deferral of debt repayments for those that lack the space to roll out large and targeted fiscal space, and coordinate capital flows to maintain foreign exchange market stability, such as establishing bilateral currency swap lines. It is critical that when we're combating the COVID-19, policymakers should not lose sight of our long-term vision for sustainable development. The current public health crisis is actually a very good example. Without enhancing public health emergency preparedness in advance, when crisis occurs, it not only causes economic losses, but more importantly, it threatens people's lives and livelihoods. So when we're coping with the pandemic, we should not forget the slow progress in achieving sustainable development, and our region is also facing a climate emergency. If we continue with business as usual, it means that our economy growth will still heavily depend on resource use, which will continue to contribute to increase in greenhouse gas emissions, at least in the next 3 decades. Similar trends are expected to be observed in North and Central Asia countries as well, such as in Russia Federation. Rising CO2 emissions in the next decade means that we will not be able to avoid a rise in temperature of no more than 1.5 degrees, because to achieve this target, the world needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050, according to IPCC. As we are entering the decade of action, the United Nations Secretary General has called for universal actions at local, people, and global levels to accelerate sustainable solutions to all world's biggest challenges, including the climate emergency. For Asia and Pacific region, to combat climate change risks and to transform our production and consumption patterns, we need to bring all the stakeholders along, including governments, businesses, and consumers. And given the world is a community of common destiny, strengthening global and regional cooperation will be critical to achieve such a transition. To address the impending climate emergency, governments have to play a key role in leading the transition out of fossil fuel by making climate change a priority. To achieve so, governments should remove fossil fuel subsidies, which was about $240 billion in 2018, is higher than the investment into renewable energy. The saving from such subsidies could be used to cover the fiscal package to cope with COVID-19 or fill in investment gap towards achieving the affordable and clean energy goals. In North and Central Asia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan, they are among the top 10 countries providing highest fossil fuel subsidies in the world. Although the fossil fuel subsidies had been generally on a downward trend since 2010, as we can see from the two figures, the fossil fuel subsidies ticked up again in 2017, likely because of the oil price recovery in 2017 and 2018. Governments can also consider introduce a carbon tax. These two figures illustrate how a carbon tax can contribute to reduction in carbon emissions and generate tax revenue. In Mongolia, for example, by levying a carbon tax at $35 per ton, it can reduce carbon emission by nearly 40% and generate tax revenue equivalent to above 2% of GDP. In addition to a carbon tax, countries should also consider establishing emissions trading schemes, or ETS. In the Asia-Pacific region, prices on carbon in the ETS vary considerably, ranging from about $1 per ton to $30 per ton. But these are still substantially lower than the required range estimated in a lot of studies. In North and Central Asia, Kazakhstan has established a ETS, which resumed operation in 2018 after a temporary suspension to tackle operational issues and reform allocation rules. Governments should also help green the financial system. This can be done by providing financial incentives such as preferential lending terms and tax breaks for green investments, or through regulatory incentives that support sustainability, reporting, disclosure, and transition. Joining task force on climate-related financial disclosure, or TCFD, can help in understanding and reporting exposure to the financial systems from climate-related risks. Countries can also consider joining the central banks and the supervisors network for greening the financial system, or the NGFS. The NGFS is a group of central banks and the financial supervisors willing to exchange the experience and the best practices to incorporate climate risks in managing the financial system. So far, the Bank of Russia and the National Bank of Georgia, they are the only two members to NGFS from North and Central Asia. Business can help in this transition by internalizing the externalities of their business operations. This can be done by incorporating ESG considerations in their business decision-making. ESG stands for environment, social, and the governance. The three factors measure the sustainability and the societal impact of a company or business's activities. They help to better assess and determine the future financial performance of companies. One way to incorporate the ESG factor is to sign up for membership in the United Nations supported Principle for Responsible Investment, the UNPRI, and follow PRI's guidelines. Because PRI guidelines establish clear instructions. So far, there are about 15% of PRI's signatories are from the Asia-Pacific region. And so far, the Russian company, UFG Asset Management, is the only signatory from North and Central Asia for PRI. Another way for companies to disclose their climate-related risk is to follow the TCFD guideline. Again, TCFD stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So far, there are 930 signatories to TCFD, and 43% of them are from the Asia-Pacific region, but most of them are from the region's developed countries like Japan, New Zealand, Australia. And so far, there are 2 Russian companies that are signatories of TCFD. Business can also reflect the true cost of their activities by putting a monetary value on greenhouse gas emissions. There is a growing business consensus that carbon pricing is the most effective way to cut carbon emissions. As of end of 2017, there are 3 Russian companies that have disclosed the use of internal carbon pricing. This kind of transparency and the disclosure of social and environmental aspects of business activities can help socially and environmentally conscious investors to make investment decisions. This can help channel funds into sustainable products and businesses. Consumers can certainly do their part as well by choosing sustainable lifestyles. For instance, choosing ride sharing, using public transport, opting for energy-efficient home appliance to reduce their own carbon footprints. Governments and the businesses can help consumers move towards sustainable lifestyle through, for instance, nudging. Nudges can be some small suggestions or some small positive reinforcements. The idea is very simple. If you want people to do something, then make it easy for them to do. Here we have an example from Singapore. So Singapore has introduced a mandatory energy label on an electric appliance to encourage the purchase of energy-efficient products. Government and the businesses can also encourage sustainable consumer behavior by incentivizing the sharing of idle and underutilized resources. For instance, platforms for ride-sharing facilities, the use of underutilized resources such as vehicles. Such local and people actions by governments, businesses, and consumers can be strengthened through global and regional cooperation. Cross-border cooperation is critical to prevent inaction and raise our ambition on climate-related goals. For instance, cooperation can be enhanced by harmonizing climate-related standards to reduce trade frictions and accelerate the diffusion of green products and services, and by cooperating on climate risk management. Countries in the region can accelerate the pace towards decarbonization by developing regional carbon markets and by scaling up transboundary power trade and transmitting electricity from countries that are rich in renewable energy resources to those that are reliant on fossil fuels. Countries should also strengthen the cooperation through the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production, which is the lead mechanism to support and implement the shift to sustainable consumption and production patterns. In Central Asia, Kazakhstan is working with the 10-year framework of program, and under the framework, Kazakhstan has published its concept for transition to green economy in 2013. North and Central Asia countries are cooperating at various regional platforms. For instance, they're taking integrated policy measures within the Eurasia Economic Union to regulate environmental criteria of products and their circulation. 5 Central Asia countries, they're working with Switch Asia to understand the challenges and identify policy priorities to achieve sustainable consumption production. Central Asia countries, they're also part of the Pan-European Strategic Framework for Greening the Economy, which provides a platform for a coordinated approach to a green and inclusive economy. Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there are also 2 partner countries of the United Nations Partnership for Action on Green Economy. Now I'm going to delve in Kazakhstan's situation in a bit more details, but very quickly. In Kazakhstan's first nationally determined contributions, it has announced to reduce its GHG emissions by 15% in 2030 compared with the level in 1990. This requires Kazakhstan to step up its actions to conduct a low carbon transition because based on the current policy projections, Kazakhstan is expected to increase greenhouse gas emission by 9% by 2030, as we can see from the blue line on the figure. In addition to become a green economy, Kazakhstan also aims to increase recycling rate to 40% by 2030 and 50% by 2050. From the figure on the left, we can see that recycling rates of industrial waste, which is the blue line, and the recycling rate of municipal solid waste, which is the red line, they have been increasing in recent years. However, the gap remains to achieve the recycling targets, especially for municipal solid waste management. But the good news is that Kazakhstan has been in the process of modernizing its waste management system to move towards sustainable consumption and production, such as implementing landfill bans on certain types of waste, gradually introducing the extended producer responsibilities, and introducing some new waste management systems. Some recommendations for the North and Central Asia countries. For the governments, they should consider reducing fossil fuel subsidies while implementing policies that are needed for a just transition. Governments should also consider establishing a national emission trading scheme and introducing carbon taxes. They should make efforts to green their financial systems. For businesses, they should adopt ESG disclosure, introduce internal carbon pricing. Consumers should adopt sustainable lifestyles, and governments and business can support consumers to adopt sustainable lifestyles. Countries should also enhance regional cooperation to share experience and the best practices in transition towards sustainable consumption of production patterns. To conclude, COVID-19 pandemic has weighed on countries' economic performance, but we should not let the crisis go to waste. COVID-19 can also become a catalyst to change the economic growth-centric development approach and to move towards a new development approach which prioritizes people and the planet. It is critical that this is critical because the region is facing a climate emergency. It's the same for the North and the Central Asian countries. They need to embed long-term sustainability in their recovery packages, which can also contribute to the subregion's economic structural transformation. All stakeholders must act collectively at local, people, and regional global levels to support this transition. Okay, Okay, thank you for your attention. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jen, for very interesting and detailed presentation. I noted in the chat that our participants would like to look more attentively at your presentation, and I suggest to share this presentation with all participants after our meeting, to give them opportunity to look more attentively and maybe to ask some additional questions.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like to suggest to move to the opinion of our eminent experts and to listen to them. And our next speaker is Mr. Talant Sultanov, Chair, Internet Society Kyrgyz Chapter, and he is a digital development specialist at World Bank Bishkek office. Previously, he worked as advisor to the Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan, and he was coordinator of the TAZA KUM National Digital Transformation Program. He worked also as director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies. He has very rich financial background, worked in different financial institutions, and he holds MA in International Finance, Columbia University, and BA in International Relations, San Francisco University. He also received executive education at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I would like to give the floor to you, Talant, please.
Thank you very much, Nikolai Nikolaevich, for your kind introduction. Thank you, colleagues, Natalia, for the opportunity to participate in this conference. Thank you, Zhengjian, for this great presentation, which I found very interesting and enriching. And I had some comments and in additions to the presentation, I think, which would help us to have the discussion on the content. I would like to start my presentation discussion with a point that last year in August, I was able to participate at the ESCAP event in Bangkok on disaster resilience. And now when I look back, I think it was a very timely discussion that ESCAP was bringing up the points. And I'm very glad that today ESCAP is also on the forefront of bringing discussions on what, how to do in the COVID situation and hopefully soon in the post-COVID situation. In regards to the presentation, I found interesting points to which I would like to comment. A couple of years ago, we did research for Kyrgyzstan on exactly the carbon contribution of the country. And I think the figures probably are very much similar to the rest of Central Asia countries. So the energy consumption per capita in Kyrgyzstan is 6 times less than average for OECD countries, whereas carbon CO2 emissions are 8 times less than for OECD countries. So we can see that the environmental impact of Central Asian citizens is much smaller to the global climate. However, the negative impact of climate change and climate emergency to the Central Asian environment is really huge. For example, today I'm sitting here in Bishkek, and for the past week the temperature has been in mid-30s, which is normal temperature for July, but now we are still in the spring. What does it mean for Central Asia? For example, for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan as mountainous countries which provide water for the Central Asia, which have the glaciers, there are forecasts that because of the global warming, by the end of the century, 95% of glaciers might be gone. This is a huge problem, which of course is not as maybe evident today, given the more eminent risks such as COVID. But for example, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are building hydropower plants, and will there be water to generate electricity in a few decades? Will there be water for the fields, agricultural fields across Central Asia? In the presentation, we spoke about the topic of fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, I think this is more applicable to Kazakhstan and other resource-rich, fossil fuel-rich economies. But if we make this term more general, energy subsidies, then this situation becomes applicable for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where we generate a lot of electricity from hydropower stations. So from one hand, over 90% of electricity is generated through renewable means, but the price for electricity is very inexpensive, so it could be some of the lowest in the world. In Kyrgyzstan, the price per kilowatt hour is less than 1 cent, and the price has not changed for over a decade, which brings a lot of inefficiencies in energy consumption. And in the presentation, there was a slide on what we can do as people, and like for housing, we could make them more energy sufficient, but because electricity is so cheap, people have not been investing in energy sufficient housing. And if I come from the more global and country level to more individual level, exactly on this slide, it says what we can do as people, as individuals, in terms of food waste, maybe in terms of sustainable transport. From one hand, I think in Central Asia, traditionally, there is not as much food waste, but the trend is negative. I think especially in the rural areas. There is another negative aspect with food is the very bad nutrition practices, especially in the rural areas. The fast food is growing. This contributes to a lot of non-communicable diseases. Of course, COVID is a virus, but then in addition to that, there are a lot of sicknesses that bad food is bringing to the people's health. And here I wanted to bring one point is May 31st is the World No Tobacco Day. And then again in Kyrgyzstan, I think tobacco is the cheapest in the world. A pack of cigarettes can cost less than $1. And that contributes a lot to the people's health. So this is something that we need to also pay attention to. There was one slide in the presentation about investments in the ICT and the transport. And I'm very glad that these two aspects were brought together, because currently all the Central Asian countries are investing millions of dollars to build the fiber optic lines, whereas a few years ago, countries invested, especially Kyrgyzstan, hundreds of millions of dollars to build roads. But if there was a concept of sharing infrastructure and co-deployment, countries could have saved lots of millions of dollars doing these two activities together. The time would be, at the moment, all of our countries would be much more connected, especially in light of the COVID situation. So I think these are some of the topics that I wanted to bring up for the discussion, and looking forward to more questions and comments as we discuss further. Back to you, Nikolai. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talant. I agree with what you're saying, and I would like to add regarding the co-deployment of infrastructure, as you highlighted. We understand the importance of this, and ESCAP jointly, our office participates in these activities of different divisions of ESCAP. We are implementing currently project on co-deployment of infrastructure for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I think it can influence the future activities of these countries and other North and Central Asian countries, especially with face of COVID-19 impact. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I would like to move to our another speaker, Dr. Alemgul Karimrey. She is a postdoctoral researcher Kazakhstan National University, and she holds a PhD in science and technology. Her PhD thesis was devoted to decarbonization of residential building in Kazakhstan, and she had 10 years research experience in energy and ecology. In 2019, she received the Women of Science Award from Elsewhere. And she was a consultant at World Bank, UNDP, International Energy Agency, and other institutions. Currently, she is doing research at Al-Farabi University, focusing on air quality in Kazakhstan. The floor is yours, Alimgul, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. As regards to fossil fuel subsidies in Kazakhstan, there have been many discussions on the plans to phase out fossil fuel subsidies in Kazakhstan. And however, recently, Ministry of Energy adopted fixed cap rates on the electricity prices. And previously, it was planned that administrative regulation of the electricity prices will be removed, but currently the government continues to regulate electricity prices. And recently, some power plants were complaining that these prices are too low to cover the investments necessary to update the energy infrastructure, because currently nearly 70% of the power generation in Kazakhstan comes from coal power plants. Most of them are old, and there is a need for the investment in the energy sector, particularly within the framework of the Paris Agreement and Kazakhstan's commitments to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. There is a need for the reforms in the prices in energy, which also poses a barrier for energy efficiency projects. But however, due to pandemic situation, there was some reductions of some discounts for the municipal expenditures for the households, meaning that this situation with pandemic can further postpone the energy sector reform and reform in the energy prices, because it would be difficult also for the government to increase energy prices when there is a growing unemployment rate, and as well as currently the country is facing devaluation of the national currency, meaning that investments in the green projects may be more complicated. Although there are also some could be positive impacts, like there have been more than two months of lockdown period, and most of the some of the companies managed to conduct work online, and people are traveling less and understanding that there is a way to work more effectively even on the distance. And all the universities and schools are working. I think that it was not bad experience with online education, and probably there could be some behavioral changes, but of course the impact of the pandemic should be furthermore researched with the better data. But in general, this could be used to change behaviors of the people in the future. Also, there is a risk that even after the pandemic situation, the emissions and energy consumption will grow further, because there is no structural change in the technologies. But there could be some positive message sending to some message sending to the population that the diseases and deaths, mortalities due to COVID is higher at the regions where there is more air pollution. So the reduction of the air quality, air pollution should be one of the priorities, because this is one of the risk factors which increases COVID mortality. So this up to the governments whether they prioritize environmental activities and how they send this message to the population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alemgul, for your vision. I would like to introduce our another speaker, Dr. Roman Vakulchuk. He is Senior Research Fellow, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He holds PhD in economics, worked for many financial institutions like ADB, GIZ, World Bank, and OECD. He was also a visiting research fellow at Johns Hopkins University and worked for Shell company in Germany. And he received the Gabriel El Salim International Award for Excellence in Consulting. He specializes in energy, renewable energy governance, natural resource management, climate change, economic transition, public sector reform in Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. The floor is yours, Roman, please. Roman, can you hear us? I think something with connection. Roman, are you with us? I think we lost connection with Roman. Probably when we are reconnecting with Roman, I would like to suggest to move to questions and answers for our experts. And for this purpose, when Roman will be reconnected, we will give him the floor. But meanwhile, I suggest Natalia to moderate the session of questions and answers and to ask questions to our eminent experts. Please, Natalia, I give you the moderation.
Thank you so much, Nikolai. I hope everybody can hear me. Is that Roman being back?
Yes, I don't know what happened.
Roman, over back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Nikolai. I missed probably parts of your introduction. Yeah, it's a big pleasure to be here today with you and share the podium with so many distinguished speakers. It's also a pleasure to share some of our insights of the Institute that we are working together on the issues related to the decarbonization in Central Asia and also in the North Asia. So I think it was a very excellent presentation, followed by the very great input from other speakers. My input is threefold. First, I would like to say a few words about the risks of not decarbonizing. I think it's very important to to point out that with the falling global oil prices and all the global trends concerning the adoption of renewable energy and clean production, we see that many of the future fossil fuel reserves that the countries of the Central and North Asia have are they being converted into already stranded assets? So which means that the future extraction and production and the use of those resources may be already questioned, especially if the world is largely shifting towards the adoption of green energy. So there's a risk of excessive reliance on this source of revenue, which is based on the fossil fuels. So that's one risk. The second risk also relates to the issue that was first raised by Talent and then also by Mgul, and this concerns the more broader impact of the continuous use of fossil fuels in the domestic production. And the air quality is a very important point. And Talan, probably you know, I mean, you live in Bishkek, and Bishkek for the last 2 years, especially in winter, has had a really difficult time in terms of the air pollution, right? So, I mean, it's very impact in terms of the people's health. I mean, a real excessive use of coal, for example, and also coal subsidies, they just, further trigger the use of these resources, which are not so sustainable in terms of the people's health. Another important aspect of this, which is global, and that's another risk, is that there's now discussion of the possible European carbon tax, right? So it's a carbon adjustment tax that will be applied to any trade between the European Union and other members that might join this club, which means that the trade between, for example, the region and the Europe will be largely affected. So it's really time to decarbonize at this stage. So this is about risks. The second point is about the external dimension in this whole discussion, which I don't think was covered by the excellent presentation by Zhenshen, but we also have to look at the situation and not only to talk about what the local actors can do. And Zhenshen, you rightly mentioned that the governments have institutions that are supportive of the fossil fuels, right? You also have the consumption that is still based on traditional fossil fuels. But also, if we look at the external actors, and in particular big countries and big investors, and I just like to give you one concrete example, and that's the example of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and overall, for example, Chinese investment in Central Asia. Well, in a study we did, we found that over the last 15 years, China invested more than $90 billion in energy projects in Central Asia. And out of this 90 billion, it's actually less than 1 billion that went into the green energy or renewable energy. So you can imagine like the scope and the volume of external investment coming into the traditional fossil fuel production, right? With green energy accounting for less than 1%. And of course, when big investors, they come and provide affordable loans and investment to the countries, it's very attractive. I mean, especially when there's a shortage and lack of investment in that industry, in the overall development. So one also has to take into account that any of the external initiatives also promoted by, for example, within the Eurasian Economic Union, promoted by the European Union, to what extent those I think it's a very important factor, right? Because I mean, the local governments, they're really dependent, and even like countries, even like Kazakhstan to some extent, but of course more countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, they're extremely dependent on financial assistance. And so as long as external initiatives don't take into account sustainability aspects, I don't think it's the local actors can promote the change on their own. So that's also very important. I mean, there are some initiatives coming, for example, from the European Union that was also mentioned. Also this year in January, I think there was this Green Central Asia initiative that was launched in Berlin, but they still lack the sort of the financial support in this regard. The third message is, okay, so with these risks and with this status quo, what can be done? What are the measures? Well, I think if we talk about the global investment in renewable energy, I'm sure, there's no shortage of funds. In 2018, 273 billion US dollars were invested into the renewable energy globally, which means that, there's a big pool of investors who are interested and they're very ready to invest in different markets. But Central Asia and also North Asia was not really part, and the total amount of investment didn't exceed 1.5 billion only of US dollars, right? So which means that the region has definitely untapped potential, and this potential can be utilized through, I think, very active improvement and promotion of the investment climate. And I think one can actually build. There was a message that by Aingul that actually it's difficult during the pandemic time to finance green energy related projects. I think if one tries that in terms of, for example, providing tax holidays, in terms of providing very attractive conditions for the existing domestic businesses, and try to extend this investment framework and those conditions to external investors, I think this scheme should work, so that the local governments can actually provide incentives for foreign investors, for example, not to pay taxes for a certain period of time, and basically to benefit all the same from the same incentives that the domestic businesses are benefiting now from the fiscal and support measures during the COVID time. Another very important aspect of promoting renewable energy is that, well, we know that, and this was also mentioned, the issue of global remittances, right, which is now falling, and the dependence of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and also the World Bank projects that this year there will be 20% drop in the remittances from outside to the Central Asian region. So we also know that if we develop renewable energy, it also has a lot of employment benefits, because it actually increases opportunities for employment, and for giving this high share of labor migrants that go outside to work in the other countries. I think it's also underutilized potential that actually they can serve and work in the renewable energy projects, both in wind and solar. Plus, the region has also many comparative advantages compared to other places. It's one thing to develop renewable energy in the Netherlands when there's very limited space, right? But you have countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which are not so densely populated. So it's very attractive. It must be very attractive for many investors to invest. But I think the point here is that not many investors and global investors know about the region, about all these opportunities. So awareness raising and capacity building is very important in this regard. And finally, also, I think a point that would connect things that were mentioned by Talant and Aingul is that I think, and also actually by Nikolai, is that it's possible to use the existing infrastructure by developing electric mobility. I think that, well, there's still no market for electric cars. And I'm now based in Norway. Actually, Norway is one of the has most of the developed electric mobility markets in the world, with its high share and actually rising share of electric cars. So it's actually, and Norway managed to introduce these drastic changes and make it attractive for the electric cars in a very short period of time, which I think also should be, deserve some more close attention from the regional governments in Central Asia to look at how to promote electric cars. So I think that's it for me for now, but I'm very much looking forward to further discussion.
Thank you, Roman, for a very interesting view and your vision. I think it's very relevant for our sub-region and will be taken into consideration by policymakers. And as I mentioned, I would like to give moderation to Natalia for question and answer session. Please, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Nikolai. Thank you very much to the speakers for the very interesting information and also for the views that you have shared. I will do the Q&A session in the following way. Some questions are quite similar to those that we have received already, so I will try and compile a few questions by topic. So if you don't hear your exact question, but it is to your theme, then please accept that as well. And so I will start with one question that we have received when people registered. And this question I will direct at Mr. Talant Sultanov. And the question is, how will the coronavirus pandemic and its impacts likely affect Central Asian governments?
Thanks so much, Natalia, for the very interesting question. Well, I think Central Asia is maybe a small microcosm of what's happening globally. And I think everywhere the rules of the game are somewhat changing. There are different ongoing debates because of the coronavirus. I think one issue is on the global level is what kind of governments are better prepared to address such crises. And there are some saying that more authoritative centralized governments are better suited to address the COVID. However, even if we look at the Asian countries' experience, it seems that liberal democracies have been very successful in addressing the COVID situation. So the debate is still ongoing. And here in Central Asia, we also have governments on a different kind of stages of the spectrum. Second issue, I think, has to do with privacy and the health and safety of the situation. Again, there is a debate how much citizens should be giving up their privacy in return for safety and health concerns. And of course, in situations of crisis, citizens are ready to give up some of their liberties, but there is a temptation, I think, when you have a more centralized government, not to give back these freedoms when the crisis goes away. So in general, I think what might be in Central Asia happening is the revision or revisiting of the existing social contract. I think in general, the social contract at the moment or up to COVID was that, for example, in resource-rich countries, the revenues from the resources would cover kind of social support, and people really or businesses really didn't have to, let's say, diligently pay taxes. In resource-poor countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, we had another resource that we would export. It's the labor migrants. And it was mentioned in the presentation and by the speakers, remittances are coming down drastically. But there is another aspect to that is not only remittances are coming down, but also migrants are returning. There are hundreds of thousands of migrants from our countries working abroad, maybe millions. And some of the people who finished school or maybe even didn't finish school and were planning to go abroad, they are staying in the country. So this means that you have a big group of politically active people. And given that there are major elections coming up in several of our countries, I think the elections results are becoming less predictable. So I think this is the maybe brief answer to this, of course, very complex question. Thank you.
That is actually a very interesting insight that the restricted movement of populations could have these very important secondary effects that maybe nobody has considered in such depths. So let's see if your predictions become true and something unexpected may happen. May I ask Roman to maybe add a few thoughts onto that question as well?
Yes, it's a very good intervention by Talent. A few points I would like to mention in this regard is first, one can expect two scenarios of how the economies and also the support model can emerge after the crisis in the region. I think one can expect that with the governments increasing their support and also taking care of the mitigation measures, one can expect that, well, there'll be more presence of the government in regulating and managing the economic domain and also social domain, which to some extent I think can be very beneficial and can really help, especially when it comes to the social support, to especially to tackle those that have been exposed most to the pandemic. But at the same time, I think there's also risk that over time and in the long-term perspective, well, the governments can actually increase their share in the economy in terms of their sort of the management, and for example, I heard some discussion that some nationalization of companies, for example, is possible, and it's not only Central Asian trend. I mean, this has also been discussed in countries like France and in other European countries. So the question is, to what extent this model of like a more state support oriented model would be sustainable in the long run, because this can have implications for the private sector development. At the same time, there's also discussion that probably now is the right time to introduce some of the really drastic measures, also maybe painful measures, and painful measures are usually easier to introduce during a difficult or crisis time, because then, well, basically you can have more support for those measures, and those measures can include really large scale and advanced improvement, for example, of the business doing conditions in terms of the overall economic openness and transparency. Also, maybe it's also the time to delegate more maybe power to the private sector, to allow private economic actors to engage into kind of the more open sort of activity, also including the possible regionalization. We know that Central Asia is not so well integrated, and I mean, also because there are a lot of different external constraints that the governments can actually remove to facilitate. So I see these two scenarios, and each of them has sort of pros and cons. But I think in the long-term perspective, it's really important that the governments understand the role that the private sector can play in terms of being responsible for more sustainable development in the long-term perspective.
Thank you very much for that insight, Roman. Yes, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think this is what some clever leaders have as their motto. So, and that takes me smoothly to another question that was asked during the registration round. And this question is to Ayem Gul. The question is, which of the sustainable consumption and production policies are particularly relevant for North and Central Asia? Which are kind of the ones that could realistically be implemented? And how can the COVID-19 pandemic possibly change production and consumption patterns, especially in Kazakhstan?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, one of the important policy measure could be, of course, removing fossil fuel subsidy, because this is the most important barrier for transformation of the energy sector. We have seen that from the energy efficiency project, for example, at the current energy prices in Kazakhstan, most of them have very long payback periods and are not economically attractive, except for the projects related to switching the light bulbs. Other measures like insulation of the buildings or automatic heat supply point, those measures which would actually reduce energy consumption at the demand side, they are not economically viable with the current energy prices. And so the key point is what could be the policy which would have a minimum negative consequences of such removing fossil fuel subsidies, and how the most vulnerable and poor population can be supported at the same time. Although there are lots of practices for example, in Eastern European countries where they have conducted such transformation and tried to remove fossil fuel subsidies, at the same time support low-income and vulnerable population. So there are successful transition measures. So it could be possibly applied, especially taking into account for Kazakhstan situation. Currently in Kazakhstan, coming back to the air pollution issue, is that most of the cities of Kazakhstan are heavily polluted, and they exceed the World Health Organization standards. And in many cities, coal power plants are one of the most contributors to the air pollution in the cities. The transformation in the energy sector will have an impact on the health of the population, and these externalities should be accounted in the energy prices. Also, for a country like Kazakhstan, it's difficult to remove coal consumption, because there are also another issue with the employment in the coal sector, because some areas of Kazakhstan are this is the only economic activity in that regions, and so there should be also policies addressing the unemployment, those people which need to be accommodated in to find another jobs in other sectors. And in particular in Kazakhstan also there is another issue with renewable, is that coal combined with renewable may also may result in higher emissions, because coal is not coal power plants is basically designed for base load. It's not designed for capturing the intermittency of renewable energy sources. So we need to have more gas power plants which will work combined with renewable energy sources. So to build new gas plants, of course, there should be better tariff policy. And as I have mentioned, it would be difficult to have this tariff reforming policy during this pandemic situation and during the economic slowdown period.
Okay, thank you so much. You addressed quite a few important issues here, and I think you also managed to answer one of the questions that came through in the chat by Jansaya, I saw. So let's take that as answered. I will now give the floor to somebody who raised their hand. Let's see if this works. Please remember to unmute your mic, and whether you want to switch on the video is up to you. Please keep your question very short and to the point and make it a question. I now invite Ms. Janat Zakiyeva. Janat, if you're there with your question, then please unmute your mic and speak.
I'm sorry, no question, because I already received all the answers during discussions. So thank you very much. Yes, I have already received all the questions, all the answers.
No problem. That means that the presentation was very comprehensive and the reaction to it, but it also means that the raised hand function works. Thank you very much, Janat. Then I will move to another question that we received through the chat, and this question is to Talant. How have digital technologies, if they did at all, helped Central Asian countries to deal with the coronavirus, and were governments prepared to make effective use of ICT tools?
Thanks so much, Natalia, and for the audience for this very good question. I think in general, this COVID situation showed the importance of digital technologies, with people working remotely at home, with children not attending school. I think we were able to manage this crisis better thanks to the technological innovations. And luckily, our Central Asian countries and governments have been prioritizing digital development and digital transformation for the past couple of years. So I think they were better prepared to deal with the situation. However, the situation also showed some of the kind of bottlenecks and weaknesses in terms of digital development. For example, during this conference of 1 hour, I got disconnected 2 or 3 times, and I live in Bishkek. But even if I stay in Bishkek, I don't have broadband internet in my home. I use mobile internet. So what can we say about people in the rural areas? So in general, if we take Central Asia's internet users, maybe the statistics outside of Kazakhstan is much better situated in that, is less than global average. So in the world, half of the population are users of internet. In Central Asia, much less than half. And if we speak about broadband internet, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, it's only 4% of the population that have broadband internet. So what does it mean? We can look in the education sector. So especially for kids in the rural areas, studying has become much more difficult. So I have children here in Bishkek. They go to usually private school in Bishkek, and now they have daily classes over Zoom, and they have teachers speaking with them every day. They see their classmates even online. But we also have our niece staying with us during crisis, and she comes from a rural school in a village. She has no online classes. She had no device to access online resources, so we gave her a smartphone. And even if she has the device, she has the internet connectivity, the skills of teachers in the rural areas do not always allow to fully take advantage of the online education. So I was asking her, how are you doing in school? And she says she basically not really studying. And this is a very sad sign of growing digital divide between, let's say, urban and rural population. And I think hopefully the coronavirus situation goes away soon, but it also highlighted the need to build infrastructure faster, to build up the digital skills faster, and to actually provide very relevant local content for kids to study online. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much for this, Talan. So yes, indeed, the crisis amplifies the divisions that we have seen and made them very visible. But hopefully that is also a big flag that is being waved in the direction of governments and also businesses and other stakeholders to really do something about digital inclusion. Okay. I will now give the floor to Oliver Patterson, who has also raised his hand to ask a question. Oliver? Maybe Oliver is not there anymore, because actually I also see that the raised hand signs have disappeared. So maybe we also answered already Oliver's question. In that case, let me pick up another question from the registration and combine that with one of the questions that we received through the chat. And this is about regional cooperation. It's addressed to Roman. So what are the prospects for the regional cooperation in the light of competitive global environments and of prevailing motives of national interest due to COVID-19? And the chat question said, to increase regional cooperation is a very general policy recommendation, but when and how can we actually realistically increase regional cooperation? And doesn't COVID maybe lead to less global connectivity rather than more? Roman, over to you.
Thank you very much for this very good question. I think, well, regional cooperation is a very important factor. If we look at it from the point of view of the current pandemic, also from the point of view of the long-term development in the region. Well, until recently, the region has been actually one of the least integrated regions in the world by all different factors, for example, ease of crossing the borders or trade across the borders. This also includes like the very limited connection between the cities. I mean, we all know, actually, if you ask someone from the region, usually people are more familiar with, for example, flight connections to Europe compared to flight connections to one of the regional neighbor country. Because, I mean, there are very limited number of direct flights and so on. So there are many sort of examples that show that, well, connectivity has been quite underdeveloped in the region. But then, of course, the situation has changed after the new president in Uzbekistan came to power, and we see some very positive trends in terms of the advancing cooperation. But of course, the COVID has had some impact on that recent dynamics. And so far, I don't think that I didn't see much of the cooperation during this difficult 3 months of spring 2020 between the governments of the region. But I do believe that soon we'll see those measures, and we will see more attempts to try to instigate and promote some more regional cooperation. And when we talk about regional cooperation, I think one shouldn't think of it in terms of like covering all possible areas of cooperation. And this is probably where the problem is, because often this agenda comes and looks like to be very ambitious and difficult to implement. So I think what really is important is that if Central Asian and also North Asian governments, they could find a couple of important areas where they could try to work around, that I think would be very beneficial, because that would be very concrete. For example, and one such issue could be like the regional decarbonization. I mean, energy infrastructure in the region is still somewhat connected, and it's also aging at the same time. I mean, so aging infrastructure is a very big risk for the region. And so, I mean, when it comes to promoting decarbonization, I think there's no harm actually of uniting efforts and trying to think of what are regional measures, what can we do together in order to increase the share of renewables, in order to increase energy efficiency and all other measures. A second area would be, again, I would like to come back to my point about the cooperation with external actors. I think it's very important to have some more of a regional established dialogue with, and not to take it bilaterally, for example, with countries like China, the US, the European Union, and Russia, and so on. So it's really important that all those initiatives that are coming from external sources, that they're then taken and tried to discuss and worked on at the more like regional level compared to the sort of the bilateral level. So I think this is a very important concrete suggestions to try to focus on a couple of very important areas and then try to work on them.
Thank you very much, Roman. Yes, it's important to pick something very specific and something where every country has a real stake in, but also has something to contribute or trade, right? But that has been the Gordian knot already for many years. So let's see if COVID can help to undo it a little bit. I will now ask to Nikolai. Nikolai, we're kind of coming towards the end of our 1.5 hours. Can we extend by another 10-15 minutes, because we have a couple of questions? Looks like we could maybe manage with such additional time.
Yes, I think we can, if there is no objection from participants. Yeah, if we could expedite, please.
Okay, great. Then I would like to pose a question to Zhentian. One question that came through the chat, and that was, it's actually the first time I hear this proposal, so I don't know if you have heard it before. Some have called to postpone the SDG agenda by 10 years, from 2030 to 2040, given the COVID pressures on economic development. And in any case, it is clear that states will suffer to meet their commitments. Have there been any studies to understand how much will be required to recap or rebuild after the pandemic to reach the pre-pandemic development rates, and how this could affect the implementation of the SDGs?
Okay, thank you, Natalia. It's a very interesting question. I would say our team is currently doing these assessments. What will be because the pandemic is still rapidly evolving, and what will be the actual impact on the economic performance, not just the economic performance, but also social and the environment perspective, like how it will impact on employment, how it will impact on poverty, for example. But given the situation is still very quickly evolving, so we do not have a concrete number at hand, but it's something that we are doing at the moment, and stay tuned when we are launching this report. To postpone the 2030 agenda, I I don't think it would be a good idea, because here we would like to say that COVID, it happened in a time that we really need to transform our development model, because before, as I presented in my slides, before the COVID time, we see the progress towards the 2030 agenda. It's already very slowed, and we lack needed progress in social and environment perspective. If we slow the progress, it means that we will have more people left behind, and we will have more damage to our environment. Actually, our actions to cope with COVID, it gels well with the 2030 agenda. As I have presented in my presentation, a lot of immediate investment to cope with COVID, like investment to invest in social protection, invest in healthcare sector, invest to increase North and Central Asia's connectivity, so on and so forth. This can help us cope with COVID. Meanwhile, this will help the region's progress towards the 2030 agenda. So I don't think it is a good idea to postpone the 2030 agenda. However, we can actually link our policy actions better to progress towards 2030 agenda.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, in order for real transformation to happen, it's not automatic, but COVID could be a wake-up call, right? I think the Indian writer Arundhati Roy said it very eloquently when she said COVID-19 is a portal, and we don't need to take our baggage from before through it. We could just really use it as an opportunity for real transformation, which was what we were lacking, right? So maybe this could kickstart the decade of action. Okay, thank you so much, Zhentian. I would like to direct one question at Talant that we received, and that is, there are predictions that there will be a second wave of COVID-19. What should be the policy options to avoid more economic stagnations should such a second wave come?
Yeah, yes, indeed, very good question. I think this is the big question that's on the mind of our policymakers. So in Kyrgyzstan, just a couple of days ago, the restrictions have been lifted because it was becoming almost unbearable for the economy. The people were losing jobs, losing incomes. From the other hand, we are not sure. I'm not sure if we even have passed the first wave, let alone to pass the second wave. And we are noticing that even in the most successful countries that dealt with COVID, they are still experiencing some potential kind of fluctuations in identifying new cases. And even in such developed countries like Korea and other places, they are preparing that there would be a second wave coming. So I think for our policymakers, it's a very delicate balancing act between the health of the people and the health of the economy. And it seems that in Central Asia, governments are opting more for keeping the economy because otherwise it's people just kind of almost dying from hunger rather than dying from the virus.
Indeed, that is a big problem that a lot of parts of the world face, that the impacts of the lockdown measures are becoming much more severe and mid-term challenges than the disease itself has been so far. Good. Let me see my list, what other questions we have. Maybe one for Roman. And maybe Zhentian can then follow up also on the answer. We received the question, women are more concentrated in small business, often informal, which suffered the most during the lockdown period. What measures will be most effective to support women's business in the current environment?
Thank you, Natalia. It's a very good question, and I think it can also be related to the previous question that Talant was answering to. So exactly, I mean, the problem is that the SME sector, including women participation in the SME sector, is very much in the informal economy. Because, well, the formal economy mainly it's large companies or medium-sized companies, but the SME sector is very much in the informal economy. And what we see in terms of the mitigation measures that the governments implemented so far is that those measures, they're directed at the formal sector. And that's probably one of the main, I would say, weaknesses of the economic model in the region is that there's still very high share of the informal economy. And you have these informal businesses, and then it's very difficult to support them during the crisis. Well, because there are no formal mechanisms, there's no information about them, right? So you don't have this, it's not easy to enact formal mechanisms of support to the businesses that operate very much in the informal environment. So I think the foremost measure that actually I also haven't seen so far is that it's really important to find a way to incentivize the formalization of this informal SME sector. So I think this should be part of the stimulus packages and also the crisis measures of really to try to find a way to provide incentives in the form of the small tax breaks or even like maybe some small short-term loans that can be given for free. But in response that these businesses would then transform into more like legal entities. I think it's a very important step, which would then be also important in light of what Talant was talking about, like how to get prepared for a possible second wave. So this means that, well, this measure should be done as soon as possible in order then to be able to be more resilient when if, for example, the new phase of the epidemic comes again. So very first, I think priority should be on the government's list is really how to find a way. And maybe also this is an area where international organizations can provide some support and help in terms of finding out very easy sort of the low-hanging fruits in terms of how to make it possible. Second, I think point here is also it's very important is that it's really important to identify and to have like tools to identifying the most exposed layers of the population, including women and in SME sector, and then to really work hard on introducing a social welfare model. I think it's the crisis shows that the region doesn't really have a system of social support that would really target the most exposed parts of the population. So I mean, I know it's a very maybe far way to go, but it's still important to think of okay, what can be done in terms of the introducing more social support schemes, in terms of the reforming the healthcare system, which actually has not been very much on the agenda over the last 20 years. I don't think that, well, healthcare was also very much on the agenda of the external international organizations and donors that promote reform agenda in the region. So I think this is the area where both sides can also work on together. So, thank you.
Yes, so I fully agree with Roman just said to formalize the informal sector to help these women-led enterprises. But this is not an easy process. We've seen that governments have launched different fiscal measures to support firms in the informal sector. I think these kind of measures could be more targeted towards the women-led enterprises. For example, some conditional cash transfer program, maybe using mobile banking to ensure these financial supports could reach women. And maybe there could be some measures to lower the operational costs for women-led enterprises, like eliminating utility bills temporarily. And maybe there could be some measures to alleviate tax burden on these women-led businesses temporarily. One thing I'd like to highlight is that for governments, that when they're making these policies, they should. It's very important for them to ensure women's representation in these policy response planning and policy making. And when governments they are delivering these policies, they can do it in a more innovative ways, like take advantage of women's networks or women's organizations or other civil society organizations to ensure these benefits can reach the firms led by women. And it's also very important for countries to integrate a gender assessment in their country assessment to understand how COVID is impacting on women, including economic and social impacts, and what are some existing policies that can effectively address these challenges, and the countries can also share their experience and best practices in this area.
Thank you for the very comprehensive answers from both of you. Indeed, it's a question of understanding in a more targeted way in which sectors women entrepreneurs are mainly located, why they are informal, and then come with a comprehensive package of measures from skills development to access to technology and finance, to then really try and in a targeted way help them. But yeah, in the short term, I know some Central Asian countries already, regardless of whether somebody is informal or formal, have given support when people just signed in that they're self-employed. So to cover a first wave, that for sure was a good measure. But then how we move into the midterm, it has to be looked at in a more structured way. And I can maybe raise the issue, we really need to look at data disaggregation at the subnational level here in a big way, because then I think what COVID shows is that all the problems that are being amplified, you have to have layers and layers of information to then understand how to best tackle certain issues. Good. Actually, if everybody agrees, I would like to wrap up the question round, but I would like to give the floor one more time to Zhentian. And I would just like to ask you, you have been part of the drafting team of the Economic and Social Survey, and so you have a good overview of the situation in Asia and the Pacific in general. How would you say is North and Central Asia faring compared to its other peers in the wider region?
Thank you, Natalia. It's a very good question. Let me answer it with two parts. First, how North and Central Asian countries have been performing before COVID time and how they're performing now. So before COVID-19 took place, we see that economic performance in Asia and the Pacific region, they've already slowed, largely because of the trade tensions and rising protectionism. We expect that the economic growth in Asia-Pacific region overall would remain largely unchanged in 2020 compared with 2019. But for North and Central Asia, the situation is slightly different. The economic outlook was relatively more positive because we were expecting the oil price would hold up relatively high at around, say, $50 to $60 per barrel. And it could benefit the field-dependent countries. And also, Russia was planning some big national projects to increase investment, and these investment projects can also benefit other countries in North and Central Asia. And then COVID-19 hits and it changed the whole situation. We see that COVID-19 is affecting the key drivers of growth in North and Central Asia, like commodity exports, migrant remittance, service sector, as we have discussed. And if you remember from my slides, our current economic forecast for North and Central Asia, its downgrade is actually at a relatively larger scale compared with other subregions in Asia-Pacific region. But of course, these forecasts are based on different assumptions, and the situation is still evolving very quickly. So the situation could be different. And we see that governments in North and Central Asia, they have started to take serious interventions to support support the households and the businesses. But of course, for North and Central Asia, they're relatively undiversified structure of production and exports, yet make it very challenging for governments to respond to the pandemic crisis. So going forward, it is very crucial for North and Central Asia countries to continue the needed structural reform. I'd like to reiterate the key message from the survey. Governments need to embed long-term sustainabilities in the policy making. As Dr. Amugo mentioned that because of under lack of structural transformation, so probably after the pandemic, the emissions and energy use will increase again, and the air quality will be worsened again. We do not want to go back to that situation. So countries really need to plan their recovery packages well to ensure that we will build back better, or maybe not build back better, more build forward better, to ensure that we can have resilience and to have recovery.
Okay, thank you so much, Zhentian. I hand back over to Nikolai to wrap up today's session. Nikolai?
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, dear colleagues, dear participants. I think the last session on questions and answers showed great interest of all to the issues raised during the discussion and during the questions. I fully agree that the people and the government should take care of these important issues like privacy and health, remittances and migrant workers situation, like role of governments in crisis situation, fossil fuels and renewables, digital transformation, especially we need to pay attention to such regions like rural areas. I fully agree with Talant who raised this issue. It's really very important. We need to have, you see, equal situation everywhere. Then regional decarbonization, women in small and medium enterprises, and of course regional cooperation. Regional cooperation, I think it's really very important, and it should not be diminished or lost, especially during the crisis times. So we need to pay to this special attention. And providing my thanks to all participants, I also would like to render my special thanks to Natalia, to Zhentian, Talant, Aymgul, Raman, for for sharing very interesting views on the situation in North and Central Asia and on survey particular. And I also would like to extend my thanks to other staff like Jyoti, Gauhar, and other MPFD and Sonka staff who contributed to organization of this meeting. Thank you very much and have a nice day. All the best to you, to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys, bye.
Thank you.
Big clap to you. Thank you.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Gentian. It was so good.
No,
Yes,
thank you, Natalia. You
Thanks,
moderated
Natalia.
really well.
It was really good, actually.
Let's
The whole
reconnect
discussion
maybe. Yeah, in
it's
another
very well
chat.
done. And
Okay,
Gentian,
I will close the meeting now.
Bye.
save the record, yeah.